Every successful man believes he's built his legacy with his own two hands. Calvin Rhodes was about to discover how wrong he could be. The powerful CEO had spent decades building his empire, but when he returned unexpectedly to his country estate, what he found stopped him cold. His young son sat across a chessboard from Marjorie, the quiet housemaid who'd worked for his family for years. At first, Calvin felt inappropriate anger rising, but as he watched from the doorway, he realized she wasn't just teaching chess. Through patient moves and gentle words, she was teaching his boy something Calvin never learned to give: wisdom, resilience, and dignity. What happens when a man discovers his child's most important lessons come from the person he valued least? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Calvin Rhodes had built his life like a fortress, stone by stone, decision by calculated decision, until he stood atop an empire that stretched across 3 continents. At 57, he commanded respect in boardrooms from Manhattan to Hong Kong, his name whispered in the same breath as titans of industry. Yet as his Bentley wound through the wrought-iron gates of Millbrook Estate on that September afternoon, something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the afternoon light caught the amber leaves, or how the familiar sight of his Georgian mansion seemed both welcoming and distant, like a beautiful photograph of a life he'd forgotten how to live. The estate sprawled across 200 acres of Connecticut countryside, a testament to 30 years of relentless ambition. Calvin had purchased it when Marcus was barely 2 years old, imagining weekend gatherings, holiday traditions, the kind of generational legacy that old money families took for granted. The reality had proven different. Business had consumed those weekends, international deals had claimed those holidays, and the grand vision had settled into something more practical, a beautiful house that stood empty most months of the year. In his study, behind the mahogany desk that had once belonged to a railroad baron, hung a series of family portraits that told the story of his success and his sacrifice. The earliest showed Calvin and Rebecca on their wedding day, both young and hungry, their eyes bright with shared ambition. The next captured them with infant Marcus, Calvin's arm around his wife, both parents gazing down at their son with that fierce protectiveness that new parents know. But as the years progressed, the portraits revealed a different narrative. Calvin appeared less frequently, often away on business when the annual photographer arrived. Rebecca's smile grew more strained, her eyes sadder, until the final portrait, taken just before her death from cancer 3 years prior, showed only mother and son, with Calvin represented by an empty space where he should have stood. Now Marcus was 12, a quiet boy with his mother's thoughtful eyes and his father's stubborn chin. In the months since Rebecca's passing, Calvin had thrown himself even deeper into his work, as if the pain of loss could be outrun by quarterly reports and merger negotiations. The boy had become a stranger to him, polite but distant, like a well-mannered guest in his own home, which brought Calvin to Marjorie. Marjorie Hendricks had arrived 15 years ago, recommended by an agency that specialized in domestic staff for wealthy families. At 43 then, she had carried herself with a quiet dignity that impressed even Calvin's discriminating standards. Her references were impeccable, her manner professional but warm, and she had passed Rebecca's more rigorous interview process with flying colors. Over the years, she had become indispensable, managing the household with efficiency, maintaining the estate with care, and somehow bridging the gap between Calvin's demanding schedule and his family's needs. Calvin knew the basics of her story, the way one knows the specifications of reliable equipment. She had grown up in Hartford, never married, no children of her own. She was punctual, discreet, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the family's needs before they were voiced. When Rebecca fell ill, Marjorie had become more than a housekeeper. She had been caregiver, companion, and eventually a source of comfort for a frightened boy watching his mother fade away. In the 3 years since Rebecca's death, Marjorie had essentially raised Marcus. Calvin told himself this was temporary, that he would find more time once the next deal closed, the next expansion completed, the next crisis resolved. But quarters became years, and the temporary arrangement had calcified into something permanent that Calvin was only now beginning to recognize. The house felt different when Calvin was away, and he was away often. 11 months of the year he lived in his Manhattan penthouse, closer to his office, his meetings, his carefully ordered world of profit and loss. Millbrook Estate became a weekend retreat at best, often skipped when pressing matters demanded his attention. He told himself that Marcus preferred the stability of boarding school during the week, the estate on weekends, a structured life that would prepare him for the responsibilities that came with the Rhodes name. But Calvin suspected there was more to it. The house seemed to exhale when he left, as if it could finally relax into its true rhythm. During his rare visits, he noticed how conversations quieted when he entered a room, how Marcus became more formal, how even Marjorie's movements seemed more careful and measured. It was as if his presence reminded everyone that this was his house, his rules, his way of doing things, even when he wasn't entirely sure what those things were anymore. The truth that Calvin rarely admitted, even to himself, was that success had cost him more than money could measure. Each promotion, each acquisition, each triumph had required another piece of his time, another slice of his attention, another sacrifice on the altar of achievement. He had gained the world and lost something he couldn't quite name: the easy intimacy of family dinners, the privilege of bedtime stories, the simple pleasure of knowing his son's thoughts and fears and dreams. In quiet moments, usually late at night in his empty penthouse, Calvin wondered if this was how his own father had felt. Calvin's childhood had been marked by similar absences, though born of necessity rather than choice. His father had worked double shifts at the Ford plant, trying to lift his family out of poverty, while Calvin's mother had cleaned houses to make ends meet. The irony wasn't lost on him that all his success had recreated the very pattern he had sworn to break. Marcus, meanwhile, had grown into the spaces his father had left vacant. The boy was thoughtful beyond his years, old-fashioned in a way that reminded Calvin of his own grandmother. He preferred books to video games, chess to sports, conversation to the social media that consumed his classmates. Calvin attributed this to good breeding, proper education, the kind of refinement that money could buy. But increasingly, he suspected there were other influences at work. Marjorie had a way with the boy that Calvin envied and didn't quite understand. When Marcus was troubled by school pressures or social awkwardness or the lingering grief that still ambushed him at unexpected moments, it was Marjorie he sought out. Calvin would find them in the kitchen, Marcus perched on a stool, while Marjorie prepared dinner, their conversation flowing with an ease that Calvin couldn't replicate. Or in the library, where Marjorie would read aloud while Marcus sketched or worked on homework, their comfortable silence speaking to years of shared routine. There was something else, too, a depth to their relationship that Calvin glimpsed but never fully witnessed. Marjorie spoke to Marcus with the kind of gentle authority that comes from genuine affection, not obligation. She corrected him without diminishing him, praised him without flattery, guided him with a patience that Calvin had never possessed. Watching them together, Calvin sometimes felt like an outsider, looking in on a family that had formed in his absence. The estate itself seemed to prefer their company to his. During Calvin's visits, the house felt formal, almost museum-like. But he had noticed in stolen moments how it came alive when he wasn't the center of attention. Laughter would drift from the kitchen, or he would catch glimpses of Marcus and Marjorie engaged in some project or conversation that would pause politely when he appeared. The house kept its secrets, and Calvin was beginning to suspect that those secrets were more interesting than anything happening in his boardrooms. As his car pulled to a stop in front of the main entrance, Calvin felt the familiar weight of disconnection settle over him, home but not quite home, successful but somehow empty. He had everything a man was supposed to want, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something essential, something that might be right in front of him if he only knew how to see it. The Singapore deal had been 3 years in the making, a complex web of international partnerships that would expand Rhodes Industries into the Asian markets. Calvin had spent 6 weeks in boardrooms that smelled of expensive cologne and desperation, navigating cultural nuances and regulatory hurdles that would have broken lesser men. The contract, all 400 pages of legal architecture, represented the largest single transaction of his career, which was why, sitting in the first-class cabin of a Singapore Airlines flight somewhere over the Pacific, Calvin felt his stomach drop when he realized the original signed documents were sitting in his study safe at Millbrook Estate. His assistant had scanned everything, of course. Digital copies existed in triplicate across secure servers, but the Singaporean consortium was old-fashioned in their business practices, and they had made it clear that the physical handover of original documents was not just traditional, it was required. Without those papers, the deal would stall, possibly collapse. Competitors were circling like sharks, waiting for exactly this kind of stumble. Calvin had changed his flight without hesitation, adding another day to his already extended absence. Marcus wouldn't expect him until the weekend anyway. The boy had grown accustomed to his father's unpredictable schedule, and one more day would hardly matter. What mattered was the deal, the expansion, the carefully constructed future that depended on precision and timing. The autumn afternoon was crisp when his driver dropped him at the estate. Calvin had dismissed the man immediately. No need for him to wait. This would be a quick retrieval mission. Into the study, open the safe, grab the contract, and back to the airport for the red-eye to Singapore. He estimated 20 minutes, tops. The house felt different as he used his key to enter through the front door. It took him a moment to identify the difference. It felt lived in. Not just maintained or preserved, but actually inhabited. There was music coming from somewhere deeper in the house, something classical that he didn't recognize. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows caught dust motes that danced in lazy patterns. And there was a faint scent of something baking in the kitchen. Calvin paused in the marble-floored foyer, listening. He had expected the house to be quiet, perhaps empty if Marcus was at school and Marjorie was running errands. But clearly life was happening here, continuing in his absence, with its own rhythm and routines. For a moment, he felt like an intruder in his own home. The contract was locked in the wall safe behind the Monet reproduction in his study. Calvin moved quietly through the house, not wanting to announce his presence and get drawn into explanations about his unexpected return. The music grew clearer as he approached the library. Vivaldi, he thought, though he couldn't be sure. His knowledge of classical music was limited to what played in expensive restaurants. The library door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Calvin could see a slice of the room that made him stop completely. Marcus was there, bent over what appeared to be a chessboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. But he wasn't alone. Across from him sat Marjorie, her dark hands moving pieces with deliberate grace, her voice low and patient as she spoke. "Think 3 moves ahead," she was saying. "Not just what you want to happen, but what your opponent might do in response. Chess is like life. Every action creates consequences." Calvin felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. His son was supposed to be at school. It was Tuesday afternoon, well within school hours. And what was he doing playing chess with the help? Calvin had hired expensive tutors for Marcus, Princeton graduates who specialized in enrichment programs for gifted children. He certainly hadn't authorized the housemaid to take on educational responsibilities. "But if I move my knight there," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of thoughtful engagement that Calvin rarely heard from him. "Won't you just take it with your bishop?" "Perhaps," Marjorie replied. "But what would that cost me?" Sometimes the best strategy requires sacrifice. Sometimes you give up something valuable to gain something more valuable. The words hit Calvin with unexpected force. Here was his son, engaged in conversation with more depth and nuance than they'd shared in months, maybe years. And it was with Marjorie, the woman who cleaned his house, who prepared his meals when he was in residence. who managed the mundane details of domestic life while he focused on matters of real importance. Calvin pushed the door open wider, stepping into the library. Both Marcus and Marjorie looked up, and the change in the room's atmosphere was immediate. Marcus's open expression closed slightly, the easy intimacy of the moment dissolving into something more formal. Marjorie straightened in her chair, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Dad," Marcus said, and Calvin could hear the mixture of surprise and uncertainty in his son's voice. "I didn't know you were coming home today." "Neither did I," Calvin replied, his voice carrying an edge he didn't entirely intend. His eyes moved from his son to Marjorie, then to the chessboard between them. The pieces were arranged in a complex mid-game position, evidence of serious play rather than casual instruction. "Shouldn't you be in school, Marcus?" The boy glanced at Marjorie, a quick look that Calvin interpreted as seeking permission or support. That small gesture, his son looking to the housemaid for guidance, ignited something defensive and proprietary in Calvin's chest. "There was a faculty meeting today," Marcus explained. "School got out early." Marjorie said, "I'm sure Marjorie has many opinions about your education," Calvin interrupted, his tone sharper than he'd intended. "But I pay for professional tutors to provide your academic enrichment, not—" He stopped himself. But the damage was clear in the sudden stillness that filled the room. Marjorie rose from her chair with the kind of dignity that Calvin had seen her display in countless situations over the years. Her expression remained calm, professional, but Calvin caught something in her eyes. Not hurt, exactly, but a kind of resigned understanding that made him feel smaller than he wanted to feel. "Of course, Mr. Rhodes," she said quietly. "I was just keeping Marcus occupied until his tutor arrived. I'll go start dinner preparations," but Calvin wasn't finished. The stress of the Singapore deal, the urgency of the forgotten contract, and this unexpected scene had converged into something that demanded expression. "Marjorie, I think it's important that we maintain appropriate boundaries. Marcus has very specific educational needs, and I've made considerable investments in professional instruction. I wouldn't want there to be any confusion about roles and responsibilities." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun Calvin hadn't meant to fire. Marcus looked stricken, his gaze moving between his father and Marjorie with an expression Calvin couldn't quite read. Marjorie nodded once, her movements controlled and precise. "I understand completely," she said. "Marcus, why don't you go work on your homework while I help your father with whatever brought him home unexpectedly?" Calvin watched as Marjorie began clearing the chess pieces, her movements efficient and without drama. But there was something in her careful handling of each piece, the way she paused slightly when picking up the black king, the gentleness with which she closed the board, that suggested this game had been more than casual entertainment. "The Singapore contract," Calvin said, partly to fill the uncomfortable silence. "I need the original documents from my safe." "Of course," Marjorie replied. "Is there anything else you'll need before your return trip?" The question was perfectly professional, perfectly appropriate. But Calvin heard something else in it, a kind of patient endurance that made him wonder for the first time what it might be like to be consistently treated as less important than business documents and international deals. Marcus had gathered his things and moved toward the door, but he paused at the threshold. "Dad," he said, his voice small but determined, "Marjorie was teaching me about strategy. She's really good at chess." Calvin looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't expected. Pride. Not in his father's success or wealth or power, but in the woman Calvin had just dismissed. In that moment, Calvin realized he might have interrupted something more valuable than he'd understood. But the contract was waiting. The Singapore team was expecting him, and the deal that would define his legacy hung in the balance. Whatever was happening in this library would have to be sorted out later, when there was time for such domestic concerns. The Singapore deal closed successfully, as Calvin had known it would. The handshake with the consortium leaders, the ceremonial exchange of documents, the congratulatory dinner at the Marina Bay Sands, all of it unfolded exactly as he'd orchestrated. By the time his plane touched down at JFK 3 days later, Rhodes Industries had expanded its Asian presence by 40%, and Calvin had added another chapter to his legend of corporate invincibility. But something about the victory felt hollow, tainted by the memory of Marcus's expression in the library, and Marjorie's careful dignity as she'd cleared away the chess pieces. Calvin told himself this was just post-deal fatigue, the inevitable letdown that followed major achievements. Yet as his car wound through Connecticut toward Millbrook Estate, he found himself thinking not about profit margins and market penetration, but about the way his son had looked to the housemaid for guidance. That needed to change. Calvin's solution was characteristically direct and expensive. Within a week of his return, he had hired Dr. Patricia Whitman, a former Harvard professor who specialized in accelerated learning programs for gifted children. Dr. Whitman came with impeccable credentials, published research, and a fee structure that would have funded a small college scholarship program. She was exactly the kind of professional educator that a Rhodes should have. "I want Marcus engaged 4 afternoons a week," Calvin instructed during their initial meeting in his study. "Advanced mathematics, strategic thinking, classical literature, and perhaps some beginning economics. The boy needs to be challenged intellectually, not entertained with games." Dr. Whitman was a thin woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and glasses that reflected light in ways that made her expression difficult to read. She nodded approvingly at Calvin's outline, making notes in a leather portfolio. "And the current domestic arrangements?" she asked delicately. "I understand there may have been some informal educational activities that should be discontinued to avoid confusion." Calvin appreciated her tact. "Exactly. I want clear boundaries. Marcus should understand that his education is a serious matter, not a casual pastime." The changes were implemented immediately. Dr. Whitman arrived each Tuesday and Thursday at precisely 3 o'clock. Armed with curricula that looked impressive in their complexity. Calvin had instructed Marjorie to ensure that Marcus was available for these sessions and that refreshments were provided, but otherwise, to leave the educational process to the professionals. The results were not what Calvin had expected. Marcus, who had been an engaged and curious student in the library with Marjorie, became sullen and distracted under Dr. Whitman's instruction. The boy's homework suffered, his appetite disappeared, and the easy conversations that had sometimes flowed between father and son dried up entirely. When Calvin asked about his lessons, Marcus would shrug and mumble responses that revealed nothing. "How are the sessions going?" Calvin asked Dr. Whitman after 2 weeks of these unsatisfactory reports. "Marcus is quite bright," she replied carefully, "but he seems resistant to advanced instruction. Perhaps he's been allowed too much casual learning and needs time to adjust to more rigorous academic expectations." Calvin nodded, accepting this explanation because it fit his preconceptions. But privately, he began to notice things that troubled him. Marcus no longer lingered in the library after school. The boy avoided the kitchen, where he'd previously spent time with Marjorie. Most concerning, Marcus had developed a habit of disappearing to his room immediately after dinner, claiming homework that Calvin suspected was mostly an excuse for solitude. It was during one of these troubling weeks that Calvin discovered the book. He'd gone to Marjorie's, quarters above the garage, to discuss the weekly household schedule, a conversation that used to happen naturally in the kitchen, but had become formal and appointment-based since the library incident. Marjorie wasn't in her small sitting room, and Calvin had waited, his eyes wandering over her modest furnishings with the idle curiosity of an employer who'd never really considered his employees' private life. The bookshelves surprised him. Calvin had expected to find romance novels, or perhaps some inspirational volumes, the kind of reading material he associated with domestic workers. Instead, he found an impressive collection of literature, biography, and history. Dickens sat next to Maya Angelou, Tocqueville beside Frederick Douglass. But it was the chess book that stopped him entirely. Modern Chess Strategy by Ludic Pachman was dog-eared and heavily annotated, its margins filled with notes in Marjorie's careful handwriting. Calvin opened it randomly and found himself looking at complex diagrams covered with arrows and analysis, mathematical notations that spoke to serious study rather than casual interest. This wasn't the kind of book someone picked up for entertainment. It was the text of someone who understood chess at a level that Calvin, for all his business strategy, certainly didn't possess. Mr. Rhodes. Calvin turned to find Marjorie in the doorway, her arms full of folded laundry. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but Calvin caught something in her eyes, not exactly embarrassment, but a kind of resigned awareness that her private world had been invaded. "I was just waiting to discuss the schedule," Calvin said, closing the book but continuing to hold it. "I didn't realize you were such a serious chess student. It's been a hobby of mine for many years," Marjorie replied, setting down the laundry and moving to take the book from his hands with gentle but firm persistence. "More than a hobby. It seems—" Calvin found himself genuinely curious. "Where did you learn to play at this level?" Marjorie hesitated, and Calvin sensed he was approaching territory she preferred to keep private. "I've always enjoyed games that require thinking ahead," she said diplomatically, but Calvin's business instincts were engaged now. He'd spent decades learning to read people, to identify the gaps between what they said and what they meant. There was something here that Marjorie wasn't telling him, something that might explain the depth of her interaction with Marcus. "Marjorie," he said, his tone shifting to something less formal, "I realize I've never really asked about your background. Before you came to work for us, what did you do?" The question hung in the air between them. Calvin could see Marjorie weighing her response, deciding how much to reveal to an employer who had made it clear that he preferred boundaries and professional distance. "I was a teacher," she said finally. "Elementary school mostly. Some middle school." Calvin felt something shift inside him, a recognition that he'd been operating on assumptions that might be fundamentally wrong. "For how long?" 22 years. The number hit Calvin like a physical blow. 22 years of professional education experience. And he'd been treating her like she wasn't qualified to help his son with homework. "Why did you leave teaching?" he asked. Though part of him already suspected the answer might make him uncomfortable, Marjorie's expression became carefully neutral. "Budget cuts eliminated my position. It was difficult to find another teaching job at my age, with so many younger candidates available. Domestic work provided steady income and good benefits." Calvin understood the code she was speaking. Budget cuts often targeted older teachers first, and he knew enough about hiring practices to recognize the challenges that middle-aged women, particularly black women, faced in competitive job markets. "Even with excellent qualifications, you gave up a teaching career to work for my family," he said. "And it wasn't quite a question." "I needed employment," Marjorie replied simply. "Your family needed household management. It was a good arrangement for everyone." But Calvin was beginning to suspect it had been a better arrangement for the Rhodes family than for Marjorie Hendricks. They had gotten an experienced educator disguised as domestic help, someone whose qualifications they'd never bothered to investigate or acknowledge. She had gotten steady work that utilized almost none of her professional skills. Standing in her modest quarters, surrounded by the evidence of an intellectual life he'd never recognized, Calvin felt the first real crack in his certainty about the changes he'd implemented. Perhaps Marcus's resistance to Dr. Whitman wasn't about adjusting to rigor. Perhaps it was about losing access to someone who understood how to teach in ways that went beyond credentials and fee structures. Perhaps Calvin had solved the wrong problem entirely. The call from Hillcrest Academy came on a Tuesday morning while Calvin was reviewing quarterly projections in his Manhattan office. Mrs. Patterson, Marcus's guidance counselor, spoke with the carefully modulated tone that private school administrators used when delivering disappointing news to parents who paid tuition that exceeded most people's annual salaries. Were concerned about Marcus's recent academic "Performance," she began diplomatically. "His grades have declined significantly over the past month, and his teachers report that he seems disengaged in class." Calvin set down his coffee and reached for the folder his assistant had prepared containing Marcus's school records. The report cards told a stark story. In September, before Calvin's increased involvement, Marcus had been performing at the top of his class, A's in literature and mathematics. Glowing comments from teachers about his thoughtful participation and creative problem-solving. But October's interim report showed a different child. B's and C's across the board. Notes about lack of focus and seems withdrawn from classroom discussions. "Has there been some disruption at home?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Often when we see such dramatic changes, there's been a significant shift in the child's environment or routine." Calvin found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining that yes, there had been changes, but they were supposed to be improvements. He'd hired additional tutoring, restructured Marcus's schedule to be more academically focused, eliminated distractions that had been interfering with proper educational development. "Sometimes," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "children resist changes that feel imposed rather than organic." Has Marcus expressed any feelings about these new arrangements? Calvin realized with growing unease that he hadn't actually asked Marcus what he thought about the tutoring sessions with Dr. Whitman. He'd assumed, with the kind of confidence that came from decades of successful decision-making, that professional instruction would obviously be superior to whatever informal activities had been happening before. "I'll speak with him," Calvin assured her, though he wasn't sure what that conversation would accomplish. His attempts at father-son talks had always felt stilted and artificial. Like business meetings with an agenda neither participant could quite identify. That evening, Calvin drove to the estate with the intention of having exactly such a conversation. But when he arrived, he found Marcus in the kitchen with Marjorie, both of them focused on homework that was spread across the breakfast table. Calvin paused in the doorway, observing a scene that looked remarkably like what he'd tried to replace with Dr. Whitman's professional instruction. Marcus was working on a mathematics problem, his pencil moving in careful calculations while Marjorie watched patiently. When the boy made an error, she didn't immediately correct him. Instead, she asked a question that guided him toward recognizing the mistake himself. "What happens if you approach it from this angle?" she suggested, pointing to a different section of the problem. Marcus paused, considered, then erased his work and started over. This time his solution was correct, and Calvin could see the satisfaction on his son's face, the kind of genuine pleasure that came from understanding rather than being told. "That's excellent reasoning," Marjorie said, and Marcus straightened with pride. Calvin cleared his throat and both heads turned toward him. The easy atmosphere of the scene shifted immediately, becoming more formal and guarded. "Marcus, I spoke with Mrs. Patterson today," Calvin began, moving into the kitchen but maintaining the distance that seemed to characterize all his interactions with his son. "She's concerned about your grades." Marcus's shoulders slumped slightly, and he glanced at Marjorie with an expression Calvin was learning to recognize, the look of a child seeking support from someone he trusted. "I'm trying," Marcus said quietly. "Dr. Whitman gives me a lot of assignments." "That's what good tutors do," Calvin replied, though even as he said it, he wondered if that was actually true. "Challenging work is how you develop intellectual capacity." Marjorie had begun quietly clearing the homework materials from the table, but Calvin caught something in her expression, not disagreement exactly, but a kind of patient resignation that reminded him uncomfortably of his own mother. Rebecca had sometimes worn that same expression when Calvin became too focused on business solutions for family problems. The memory of Rebecca hit him with unexpected force. She would have handled this situation differently, with more intuition and less strategy. During the terrible months of her illness, when Calvin had tried to manage her treatment like a corporate project, researching specialists, optimizing schedules, quantifying outcomes, Rebecca had sometimes looked at him with gentle exasperation. "You can't optimize love. "Calvin," she'd said once, when he'd presented her with a detailed chart tracking her medication schedule. "Sometimes you just have to trust that people know what they need." At the time, Calvin had dismissed this as the kind of emotional thinking that interfered with effective problem-solving. But standing in his kitchen, watching his son struggle with changes that Calvin had implemented with the best intentions, he wondered if Rebecca had been trying to teach him something he'd been too busy to learn. "Dad," Marcus said hesitantly, breaking into Calvin's memories, "could I maybe do my homework with Marjorie sometimes? Just until I catch up with Dr. Whitman's lessons?" The question seemed reasonable, but it triggered something defensive in Calvin's chest. He'd invested considerable time and money in restructuring Marcus's education. Admitting that those changes weren't working felt like acknowledging failure in an area where Calvin was supposed to excel, providing for his family's needs. "Dr. Whitman is a professional educator," Calvin said, his tone sharper than he'd intended. "I'm sure with time and effort you'll adjust to her methods." Marcus nodded, but Calvin could see that the boy's enthusiasm for the conversation had died. Marjorie had finished clearing the table and was preparing to leave the kitchen, but Calvin noticed how she paused when Marcus spoke, how her attention remained focused on the boy, even when Calvin was clearly establishing authority. Over the following weeks, Calvin found himself paying attention to these small moments in ways he never had before. He noticed how Marcus would seek out Marjorie's presence when he was troubled, how the boy would linger in whatever room she was working in, clearly hoping for interaction that Calvin's new rules had made inappropriate. He observed how Marjorie continued to show interest in Marcus's schoolwork, asking gentle questions about his classes and offering encouragement, even though her official role had been reduced to traditional domestic duties. Most troubling, Calvin began to recognize that his increased presence and involvement hadn't brought him closer to his son. If anything, the formal structure he'd imposed had created more distance between them. Marcus was polite and obedient, but their interactions felt scripted and careful. The spontaneous moments that had occasionally brightened their relationship, brief conversations about books or games, shared observations about the world, had disappeared entirely. Dr. Whitman's reports continued to be diplomatically negative. Marcus was bright but unfocused, capable but resistant to advanced instruction. She recommended additional sessions, perhaps some educational testing to identify learning obstacles, more structured homework time to develop better study habits. Calvin found himself approving these recommendations while feeling increasingly uncertain about their value. Each new intervention seemed to make Marcus more withdrawn, not more engaged. The boy's grades at school stabilized, but at a level well below his previous performance. Mrs. Patterson's calls became a regular occurrence, each conversation circling around the same fundamental question. What had changed in Marcus's world, and could it be changed back? Calvin knew the answer, but admitting it would require acknowledging that his business instincts, his belief that professional solutions were always superior to personal ones, might be fundamentally wrong when applied to family life. It would mean recognizing that Marjorie's informal teaching had been more effective than Dr. Whitman's credentials and methods. Most difficult, it would require admitting that his own increased involvement might be making things worse, not better. Standing at his office window on a grey November afternoon, Calvin found himself thinking about legacy in ways that had nothing to do with corporate achievements. What kind of father was he becoming? What kind of man was he raising? And what would Rebecca think about the choices he was making in her absence? The questions followed him home that evening, and they were still there when he found Marcus sitting alone in the library, staring at a chessboard with no pieces on it. Calvin's discovery of Marcus sitting alone with the empty chessboard had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. There had been something in his son's posture, a kind of resigned sadness that reminded Calvin of his own childhood in ways he'd spent decades trying to forget. That night, unable to concentrate on the merger documents he'd brought home, Calvin found himself wandering through the estate's outbuildings. eventually making his way to the detached garage, where his father's old tools still hung on a pegboard he'd never had the heart to clear. Jerome Rhodes had been a man who understood the dignity of work, even when that work left his hands permanently stained with oil and his back permanently bent from leaning over engine blocks. Calvin kept his father's tools, not from sentimentality, but from a complex mixture of guilt and respect he'd never fully examined. Now running his fingers over the worn handles of wrenches and screwdrivers that had supported his family through his childhood, Calvin wondered when he'd stopped seeing such hands as honorable. His father had worked double shifts at the Ford plant, coming home exhausted but still finding time to help Calvin with homework at the kitchen table that served as both dining room and study space in their small house. Jerome Rhodes had never finished high school himself, but he'd possessed an intuitive understanding of how things worked, engines, people, the fundamental mechanics of getting by in a world that didn't offer many second chances. "Boy," his father used to say when Calvin struggled with mathematics, "you got to think about what you're trying to accomplish before you start moving pieces around. Same as fixing an engine, you got to understand how all the parts work together." Calvin had been embarrassed by his father's lack of formal education, especially as his own academic achievements opened doors to worlds his parents had never imagined. Harvard Business School had been a different planet from the working-class neighborhood where Calvin had grown up, and he'd learned quickly to minimize references to his background. Success, he'd discovered, was easier when people assumed you'd always belonged in their circles. But standing in the garage, surrounded by the honest tools of honest work, Calvin remembered something else about his father. Jerome Rhodes had never spoken down to anyone, never assumed that his lack of formal education made him less worthy of respect. He'd treated his co-workers, his neighbors, and his son's teachers with the same courteous dignity, understanding that a person's value wasn't determined by their position in life. Calvin thought about Marjorie's patient teaching, her careful way of guiding Marcus toward understanding rather than simply providing answers. There was something familiar about her approach, something that reminded him of his father's method of helping with homework, asking questions that led to discovery, celebrating small victories, never making a child feel stupid for not knowing something. The next morning, Calvin made an unusual decision. Instead of leaving for Manhattan immediately after breakfast, he lingered in the kitchen while Marjorie prepared Marcus's lunch for school. He'd told himself he was simply observing household operations, but he was really watching how she moved through these daily routines with care that went beyond mere efficiency. "Marjorie," he said as she folded a note into Marcus's lunchbox, a small gesture he'd never noticed before. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your teaching background." She glanced up, her expression carefully neutral. Over the years, Calvin had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated Marjorie was being professionally cautious rather than personally open. "I wonder if you might help me understand something," he continued. "Marcus seems to respond differently to different types of instruction. Dr. Whitman is highly qualified, but..." Calvin struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like criticism of his own decisions. "What approach did you find most effective when you were teaching professionally?" Marjorie set down the lunchbox and considered her response carefully. Calvin could see her weighing how much to reveal to an employer who had made it clear that her educational opinions weren't particularly welcome. "Every child learns differently," she said finally. "Some respond well to structured lessons and formal instruction. Others need more exploratory approaches. In my experience, the most important thing is meeting each child where they are, rather than expecting them to adapt to a single method." Calvin nodded, recognizing wisdom in her words, even as something defensive rose in his chest. "And Marcus, what type of learner would you say he is?" Marcus is very thoughtful," Marjorie replied. "He likes to understand the why behind things, not just the how. He responds well to guided discovery, being asked questions that help him find answers himself. Chess appealed to him because it allowed him to practice strategic thinking in a way that felt like play rather than work. The explanation made sense, but it also highlighted everything Calvin had gotten wrong in his approach to improving Marcus's education. Dr. Whitman's methods were rigorous and comprehensive, but they weren't designed for Marcus specifically. They were designed for an abstract ideal student rather than the particular boy who needed patient guidance and room to explore. When you were teaching professionally, Calvin found himself asking, how did you handle students who were struggling with changes in their routine or environment? Marjorie's expression shifted slightly, and Calvin sensed he'd touched on something she cared deeply about. Children are remarkably resilient, she said, but they need stability and understanding during transitions. When a child's world changes, new teachers, new expectations, new rules, they often need extra support and patience. Sometimes what looks like resistance or poor performance is really just a child trying to process changes they don't understand. Calvin felt the words land with uncomfortable accuracy. Marcus wasn't failing to adapt to Dr. Whitman's instruction because he was lazy or unmotivated. He was struggling with changes that Calvin had imposed without considering how they might affect a 12-year-old boy who'd already lost his mother and lived with an essentially absent father. How would you... Calvin started, then stopped himself. He'd been about to ask for her advice about handling Marcus's situation, but doing so would require acknowledging that his expensive professional solutions weren't working. It would mean admitting that the housemaid possessed insights about his son that he, despite his success and resources, didn't have. Marjorie seemed to understand his hesitation. Mr. Rhodes, she said gently, Marcus is a wonderful boy with tremendous potential. Whatever approaches work best for him, the most important thing is that he feels supported and valued. Children can adapt to almost any educational method if they believe the adults in their lives are truly invested in their success. Calvin heard the subtext in her words. Marcus didn't feel supported right now. The changes Calvin had implemented in the name of improvement had left the boy feeling disconnected from the adults who were supposed to care about his well-being. I appreciate your insights, Calvin said, and found that he genuinely meant it. But even as he spoke, part of him was calculating the complications that would arise from acting on those insights. Admitting that Marjorie's approach had been more effective than Dr. Whitman's would mean more than changing educational strategies. It would require confronting his own assumptions about value and expertise, about who deserved respect and why. Calvin excused himself and drove to Manhattan. But Marjorie's words followed him throughout the day. During meetings and conference calls, he found his attention drifting to questions that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or market analysis. When had he stopped believing that wisdom could come from unexpected places? When had he started equating credentials with capability, position with insight? His father would have known what to do about Marcus. Jerome Rhodes had possessed an instinctive understanding of what children needed, even without degrees or professional training. He'd known how to listen, how to guide without controlling, how to show respect for others regardless of their station in life. Calvin realized, with growing discomfort, that in his climb towards success, he'd left behind some of the values that had made his father a better man than Calvin had become. The tools hanging in the garage weren't just relics of a simpler time. They were reminders of a way of approaching the world that Calvin had abandoned in favor of strategies that worked in boardrooms but failed in the places that mattered most. Calvin's restless evening in the garage had stirred memories that followed him through the week, creating an unusual distraction from the Yamamoto acquisition that should have commanded his complete attention. By Friday, his assistant had noted his uncharacteristic inattention during meetings, and Calvin realized he needed to address whatever was unsettling him before it affected his professional performance. That weekend, while Marcus was at a school function and Marjorie was running errands in town, Calvin found himself in his study's storage closet, looking through boxes he'd packed away years earlier but never quite managed to discard. His mother's letters were in a shoebox that had traveled with him through 3 moves, from his first apartment after Harvard to the Manhattan penthouse to finally here, stored away like documents from a life he'd outgrown. Dorothy Rhodes had written to him faithfully during his college years and into the early decades of his career. Her letters filled with news from the neighborhood, updates on his father's health, and gentle observations about the world that often proved more insightful than anything Calvin encountered in his business education. He'd stopped reading them carefully somewhere around his second promotion, when the gap between their worlds had seemed to widen beyond bridging. Now, sitting in his leather chair with the afternoon light streaming through tall windows, Calvin opened one of the letters at random. It was dated 15 years earlier, written shortly after Marcus was born. Dear Calvin, your father and I are so proud of the man you've become and the success you've earned through your hard work. We know the world you live in now is different from the one where you grew up. But I hope you remember the lessons we tried to teach you about treating people with respect, regardless of their circumstances. I've been thinking about Mrs. Washington, who cleaned office buildings downtown for 30 years before her arthritis got too bad to continue. She raised 4 children, sent 2 to college, and never missed a day of work that wasn't for a genuine emergency. The lawyers and executives in those buildings saw her as just the cleaning lady, but I knew her to be one of the wisest, most disciplined people I ever met. What I'm trying to say, son, is that a person's value isn't determined by their job title or bank account. Some of the most important lessons you'll learn, and that Marcus will learn, might come from people the world considers ordinary. Don't let success make you forget to see the extraordinary qualities in everyday folks. I hope this doesn't sound preachy. I just worry sometimes that the higher you climb, the harder it becomes to remember where you came from and why that matters. Love always. Mama Calvin read the letter twice, feeling something uncomfortable settle in his chest. His mother had been trying to warn him about exactly the blindness he was discovering in himself, the tendency to value people based on their position rather than their character, their credentials rather than their wisdom. Mrs. Washington. Calvin had a vague memory of her from childhood visits to his mother's workplace. A dignified black woman who'd always greeted him politely and asked about his schoolwork with genuine interest. Calvin realized now that his mother had seen in Mrs. Washington the same qualities he was beginning to recognize in Marjorie: intelligence, strength, and dedication that transcended the limitations of their circumstances. The parallel was uncomfortable, but undeniable. For 15 years, Marjorie had managed his household with skill and discretion, had helped raise his son with patience and wisdom, and had maintained her dignity despite being treated as essentially invisible by the man who benefited most from her presence. Calvin thought about the chess lessons he'd begun observing from the hallway outside the library. Despite his formal prohibition of such activities, Marjorie had found ways to continue helping Marcus with strategic thinking, brief conversations during rides to school, casual games during homework time that somehow always taught larger principles. Calvin had initially been annoyed by this quiet resistance to his instructions, but he was beginning to understand it as something else. A professional educator's commitment to her student that transcended employment boundaries. The business crisis that erupted the following week should have consumed all Calvin's attention. Yamamoto Industries had discovered irregularities in the due diligence process that threatened to derail the acquisition entirely. Calvin spent 18-hour days in conference calls with lawyers and accountants, flying between New York and Tokyo to salvage a deal that represented the culmination of 2 years' work. But even in the midst of corporate combat, Calvin found his thoughts returning to domestic concerns that had never previously competed with business priorities. During a break between meetings in his Tokyo hotel room, he found himself wondering not about profit projections, but about whether Marcus was struggling with Dr. Whitman's latest assignments. While reviewing contract amendments, he thought about Marjorie's observation that children need stability during transitions. And he wondered what kind of stability he'd been providing for his son. The realization that struck him with particular force was how little he actually knew about the daily rhythms of his own household. He could recite quarterly earnings for dozens of companies, but he didn't know what time Marcus did his homework or what he ate for breakfast. He understood the strategic implications of currency fluctuations in emerging markets, but he'd never bothered to learn what teaching methods worked best for his own child. When Calvin finally returned from Tokyo, the deal saved. Though at considerable cost to his sleep and sanity, he arrived at the estate to find Marcus and Marjorie in the library again. This time, instead of interrupting, he watched from the doorway as Marjorie guided his son through a chess problem that was clearly about more than moving pieces on a board. "See how your opponent's knight placement creates multiple threats?" Marjorie was saying. "In chess, as in life, you have to think about not just what people are doing, but why they're doing it. Understanding motivation helps you predict behavior." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then moved his bishop to block one threat while creating a counter-threat of his own. "Like this?" "Exactly. You're not just defending, you're turning their pressure into your opportunity. That's the mark of strategic thinking." Calvin watched his son's face light up with understanding and felt a pang of something he couldn't immediately identify. When had he last seen Marcus look so engaged, so genuinely excited about learning? Dr. Whitman's sessions certainly didn't produce this kind of enthusiasm. "Dad." Calvin realized he'd been discovered in his observation post. Marcus was looking at him with an expression that mixed hope with uncertainty, the look of a child who wants his father's approval but isn't sure how to earn it. "I was just watching," Calvin said, stepping into the library. That looked like an interesting problem. Marjorie rose from her chair, clearly preparing to excuse herself, but Calvin surprised himself by saying, "Please don't let me interrupt. I'd actually like to understand what you're teaching." The words hung in the air with unexpected weight. For the first time since the initial confrontation about boundaries and roles, Calvin was explicitly acknowledging Marjorie as a teacher rather than just an employee. The recognition felt both overdue and somehow insufficient, a small step toward correcting years of willful blindness. Marcus looked between his father and Marjorie with barely contained excitement. "She's teaching me about tactical sacrifices," he said. "Sometimes you have to give up something valuable to achieve something more important." Calvin nodded, wondering if his son understood that they were no longer talking only about chess. In this room, with these two people, Calvin was beginning to learn about sacrifices of a different kind, the things he'd given up in pursuit of success, and the relationships he'd devalued in his climb toward achievement. His mother's letter had been right. The most important lessons often came from people the world considered ordinary. Calvin was finally beginning to understand what he'd been missing. The emergency call came at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Calvin's assistant in Manhattan needed him to locate the Yamamoto contracts immediately. A regulatory filing deadline had been moved up, and the documents were locked in his estate safe rather than the office vault where they should have been. "Can't Marjorie help you access the safe?" his assistant asked during their hurried phone conversation. "She doesn't have the combination," Calvin replied, already throwing clothes into a bag. "I'll have to drive up there myself." What Calvin didn't mention was that Marjorie wasn't at the estate that morning anyway. Marcus had come down with a fever during the night, and she'd taken him to the pediatrician for what they hoped was just a routine illness, but wanted to have checked to be safe. Calvin had approved this plan during a brief phone conversation at 5 a.m., grateful that someone was available to handle the situation while he managed the business crisis that demanded his immediate attention in Tokyo. The estate felt hollow and strange, with both Marcus and Marjorie away. Calvin retrieved the contracts quickly, but as he prepared to leave, he realized he should check on a few things while he was there. The landscaping crew had been working on drainage issues near Marjorie's quarters above the garage, and she'd mentioned some water staining on her ceiling that might need attention. Calvin had been in Marjorie's apartment only a handful of times over the years, usually for brief, business-related conversations about household matters. Now, alone in the space she'd made her home for 15 years, he found himself really looking at her environment for the first time. The apartment was modest but warm, furnished with pieces that suggested careful selection rather than expensive taste. What struck Calvin immediately was how much the space revealed about its occupant's character. Books were arranged not just decoratively, but in ways that suggested frequent reference. A small desk by the window was organized with the precision of someone who took mental work seriously. Plants thrived in every available spot of natural light. Calvin checked the ceiling stain, minor, easily repairable, but found his attention drawn to the bookshelf he'd noticed during his previous visit. This time, however, he looked more carefully at what surrounded the chess materials. Education textbooks, many of them recent editions that suggested ongoing study, journals about child development and learning theory, professional publications that spoke to serious engagement with educational practice. It was while examining a volume on differentiated learning strategies that Calvin noticed. The frame tucked discreetly behind other books, almost hidden from casual view. He pulled it out, expecting to find a family photograph or perhaps some sentimental keepsake. Instead, he found himself staring at a college diploma. Marjorie Hendricks had graduated magna cum laude from Teachers College at Columbia University with a master's degree in elementary education. The diploma was dated 28 years ago, which meant she'd earned her advanced degree well before coming to work for the Rhodes family. But it was the teaching certificate mounted beside the diploma that truly stopped Calvin in his tracks. The document was from the Connecticut State Department of Education, certifying Marjorie as a master teacher in elementary and middle school education. But more shocking than the credential itself were the dates. The certificate had been renewed multiple times over a 25-year career, with the final renewal dated just 18 years ago, 3 years before she'd come to work for Calvin's family. Calvin sank into Marjorie's reading chair, the documents trembling slightly in his hands. A master teacher. Not just someone with classroom experience, but someone recognized by the state as exemplary in her field. And she'd given it up to manage his household and help raise his son, with growing urgency. Calvin began looking more carefully through Marjorie's things, not out of nosiness, but from a desperate need to understand what he'd missed, what he'd failed to see. In the small filing cabinet, he found folders that told a story of professional achievement that made his business successes seem somehow smaller by comparison. Letters of commendation from school principals. Thank you notes from parents whose children had flourished under Marjorie's instruction. Professional development certificates from advanced training programs. Student achievement test scores showing consistent, dramatic improvements in classes she'd taught. A newspaper article from 15 years ago about innovative educators making a difference that featured Marjorie's work with at-risk students, but it was the final folder that broke Calvin's heart entirely. Labeled simply Marcus, it contained 15 years of careful documentation. Not just records of his son's academic progress, but thoughtful analyses of his learning style, his emotional development, his interests and challenges. Marjorie had been studying Marcus with the same professional attention she'd once given to her students, applying her expertise to help him grow in ways Calvin had never recognized or appreciated. The folder contained Marcus's artwork from age 3 to 12, preserved and dated. Report cards with Marjorie's handwritten notes about how to support his development. Photographs of science projects, school plays, and achievement ceremonies that Calvin had missed. Lists of books Marcus had enjoyed, with notes about why they'd appealed to him and what they revealed about his intellectual curiosity. Most devastating was a letter Marjorie had written but never sent, dated 2 years after Rebecca's death. Dear Mr. Rhodes, I know this isn't my place, and I hope you'll forgive the presumption, but I feel I must share some observations about Marcus's development. He's a remarkable child with exceptional potential, but he's also struggling with grief and feelings of abandonment that are affecting his confidence and academic performance. As someone who spent her career working with children facing emotional challenges, I believe Marcus would benefit from more consistent emotional support and academic engagement. He's intellectually curious and responds well to patient, individualized instruction that meets him where he is, rather than where standardized curricula expect him to be. I realize you have access to excellent professional resources, and I don't mean to suggest that my experience is superior to formal therapeutic or educational interventions. But I wanted you to know that Marcus often speaks about feeling disconnected from you, and I believe he would flourish with more attention from his father. I hope you don't find this letter inappropriate. My only concern is Marcus's well-being, and I thought you should know how a professional educator sees his current situation. The letter was never finished, never sent. Calvin could see places where Marjorie had started to write more, then stopped. Clearly deciding that such observations weren't her place to share, Calvin sat in the silence of Marjorie's apartment, surrounded by evidence of a life devoted to education and child development, holding documentation of professional expertise he'd never bothered to investigate. For 15 years, he'd employed one of Connecticut's most accomplished educators to clean his house and prepare his meals, while paying strangers thousands of dollars to provide his son with educational services that were inferior to what was already available in his own home. The scope of his blindness was staggering. He'd made assumptions about Marjorie's qualifications based on her race, her role, her quiet demeanor, never questioning why someone would choose domestic work over professional teaching. He'd never asked about her background, never shown interest in her qualifications, never recognized that her patience with Marcus and insight into his needs came from decades of professional experience working with children. Calvin thought about all the times he'd dismissed Marjorie's observations about Marcus as the opinions of someone unqualified to offer educational guidance. He remembered his condescending explanations about professional instruction being superior to casual help with homework. The memory of his behavior made him physically ill, but perhaps most disturbing was the realization that Marjorie had sacrificed her calling to serve his family. She'd given up a career she clearly loved and excelled at to provide stability for Marcus during the most difficult period of his young life. While Calvin had been building his empire, Marjorie had been quietly, professionally, lovingly raising his son with expertise he'd never acknowledged or valued. Calvin's phone buzzed with another urgent message from his assistant, reminding him about the Tokyo flight he needed to catch. The Yamamoto deal was waiting, requiring his immediate attention and expertise. But for the first time in his career, Calvin found himself questioning whether his professional obligations were really more important than understanding how profoundly he'd misjudged the people closest to him. Sitting in Marjorie's chair, surrounded by evidence of her sacrifice and his own blindness, Calvin realized that everything he thought he knew about his household, his son, and his own judgment had been fundamentally wrong. The question now was what he intended to do with this knowledge. Calvin missed his flight to Tokyo for a man whose entire professional identity was built on precise timing and unwavering commitment to business obligations. This should have been catastrophe. The Yamamoto deal hung in the balance. His team was waiting for his arrival, and competitors were circling the wounded acquisition like corporate vultures. Yet as Calvin sat in Marjorie's apartment, surrounded by evidence of his own blindness, he found himself making a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. He called his assistant and pushed back the Tokyo meetings by 48 hours. He told his team to handle the preliminary negotiations and assured them he would arrive by Thursday with a clear strategy. What he didn't tell them was that he needed time to address a more pressing crisis, one that had been building for 15 years while he'd been too busy achieving success to notice he was failing at life. The ride back to Manhattan gave Calvin time to process what he'd discovered and to begin formulating a plan that felt as complex as any business strategy he'd ever developed. But this wasn't about profit margins or market positioning. This was about dignity. respect, and 15 years of accumulated injustice that needed to be addressed with the same careful attention he'd always given to corporate problems. Calvin's first research session took place in his penthouse office at 3 in the morning, when his usual insomnia had been replaced by something more purposeful than worry about quarterly projections. Using contacts he'd developed over decades of business relationships, he began investigating what master teachers with Marjorie's credentials typically earned, what kind of retirement benefits they received, and what level of professional recognition they commanded. The numbers were humbling. Marjorie's salary as his household manager was approximately 60% of what she could have earned continuing her teaching career. More significantly, she'd given up 15 years of contributions to the state teachers' retirement system, professional development opportunities, and the intangible benefits of career advancement and recognition. The financial cost of her sacrifice was substantial, but Calvin was beginning to understand that the professional and personal costs were even greater. He spent the following morning with his attorney and financial advisor, discussing ways to address both the historical inequity and the future relationship he hoped to build with Marjorie. The conversation was delicate. Calvin needed to find ways to honor her sacrifice without creating the impression that money could somehow compensate for 15 years of being undervalued. He was looking for acknowledgement, not transaction. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" his attorney asked after Calvin had outlined his preliminary ideas. "I'm trying to correct a mistake," Calvin replied. "A significant, long-term mistake that's affected someone's entire career and life trajectory. The legal and financial mechanisms were complex, but manageable." Calvin could establish an educational fund in Marjorie's name, create retirement accounts that addressed her lost years of teaching system contributions, and provide salary adjustments that reflected her actual qualifications rather than arbitrary domestic worker pay scales. But the more difficult challenge was personal: how to acknowledge his blindness without making the conversation about his guilt, and how to change their relationship without undermining her dignity. Meanwhile, Marcus was showing remarkable improvement in ways that had nothing to do with Dr. Whitman's expensive interventions. Calvin had quietly observed his son over the past weeks, watching how the boy responded to Marjorie's patient guidance versus the formal tutoring sessions he was still required to attend. The contrast was striking and undeniable. With Marjorie, Marcus was engaged, curious, willing to take intellectual risks and learn from mistakes. His homework was completed with care and enthusiasm, and his conversations about school subjects reflected genuine understanding rather than rote memorization. During Dr. Whitman's sessions, Marcus remained polite but distant, going through the motions of advanced instruction without the spark of real learning. Calvin had started receiving different reports from Hillcrest Academy. Mrs. Patterson called to express pleasant surprise at Marcus's renewed engagement in class discussions, his improved performance on creative assignments, and his apparent increased confidence in group activities. When Calvin asked what had changed, Marcus's teachers consistently noted that he seemed more relaxed and willing to express his own ideas, rather than trying to provide what he thought adults wanted to hear. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, and Calvin knew it corresponded directly with his quiet relaxation of the boundaries he'd imposed between Marcus and Marjorie. Without explicitly authorizing resumed chess lessons or homework help, Calvin had stopped monitoring their interactions so closely, and both Marcus and Marjorie had cautiously returned to the educational relationship that clearly served them both. Calvin's business crisis continued to demand his attention, but for the first time in his career, he found himself managing professional obligations around family priorities rather than the reverse. The Tokyo meetings were essential, but they would wait until he'd addressed the personal situation that could no longer be ignored. His team was capable of handling preliminary negotiations, And Calvin was discovering that delegating responsibility didn't necessarily mean losing control. During his final evening of preparation, Calvin found something that crystallized everything he was trying to accomplish. While looking through Marcus's school materials to understand his current academic status, Calvin discovered a handwritten thank you note that his son had apparently written to Marjorie but never delivered. "Dear Marjorie, I know Dad doesn't think I should bother you with school stuff anymore, but I wanted you to know that all the things you taught me about thinking ahead and being patient are helping me with everything, not just chess. When I get frustrated with hard problems now, I remember what you said about taking time to understand what's really being asked before I try to find the answer. Dr. Whitman is nice, but she doesn't explain things the same way you do. She tells me what I should know, but you help me figure out how to think about things myself. That's harder, but it feels better when I understand something because I worked it out instead of just being told. I miss our conversations. Sometimes I have thoughts about books or school or things that happen, and I wish I could talk to you about them like we used to. I know you're still here, but it's different now. And I don't want to get you in trouble with Dad. Thank you for teaching me that being smart isn't just about knowing facts, but about being curious and kind and thinking about how other people might see things differently. Love. Marcus P.S. I still practice the chess problems you showed me, even though we can't play together anymore. Calvin read the note twice, feeling each word like a small indictment of his own parenting. His son had been trying to maintain connection with the adult who understood him best, while carefully protecting that adult from his father's displeasure. Marcus had internalized the message that his natural learning relationship with Marjorie was somehow inappropriate. Yet he continued to value what she'd taught him and wished for the return of what they'd shared. The note also revealed something Calvin had failed to recognize. His son was actively thinking about learning, relationships, and personal growth in ways that suggested real maturity. Marcus wasn't just a child to be managed and instructed. He was a young person, capable of reflection, gratitude, and complex emotional understanding. All qualities that Marjorie's patient guidance had nurtured and that Calvin's more rigid approaches had inadvertently discouraged. Calvin spent Wednesday evening walking through the estate, preparing for a conversation that felt more consequential than any business negotiation he'd ever undertaken. In the library, where he'd first discovered the chess lessons that had started this entire journey, Calvin realized that everything was about to change. He could continue managing his household according to outdated assumptions and arbitrary hierarchies, or he could acknowledge the truth about what his family actually needed and who was best equipped to provide it. The choice was clear, but making it would require Calvin to confront not just his treatment of Marjorie, but his own prejudices about worth, value, and the sources of wisdom. It would mean admitting that some of his fundamental beliefs about success and leadership had been not just wrong, but harmful to the people he claimed to care about most. Thursday morning arrived grey and cold, matching Calvin's nervous anticipation. Today, he would begin the most important negotiation of his life, not for market share or profit margins, but for the opportunity to rebuild relationships based on honesty, respect, and recognition of each person's true value. Calvin had missed flights and delayed deals for this conversation. But as he prepared to face Marjorie with the truth about what he'd discovered and what he hoped to change, he realized that for the first time in years, his priorities were finally arranged correctly. Calvin found Marjorie in the kitchen at precisely 8 o'clock Thursday morning, preparing Marcus's breakfast with the same careful attention she'd brought to every task for 15 years. She looked up when he entered, and Calvin could see her expression shift to the professionally neutral mask she wore during their formal interactions. After everything he'd discovered, that careful distance felt like another failure on his part. "Marjorie," Calvin said, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "When you have a moment, I'd like to speak with you." "It's important," she nodded. wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "Of course, Mr. Rhodes. Let me just finish Marcus's lunch, and I'll be right with you." "Actually," Calvin said, surprising them both, "this concerns Marcus as well. Could we talk in the library after he's had his breakfast?" Something in Calvin's tone must have conveyed the significance of the moment, because Marjorie's professional composure flickered slightly. "Is everything all right? Is this about everything's going to be fine?" Calvin assured her, though his own nervousness suggested otherwise. "Better than fine, I hope. But yes, this is about the conversation we should have had 15 years ago." Marcus appeared in the kitchen, school bag slung over his shoulder, and Calvin felt a pang of affection mixed with regret. His son had grown so much over the past months, not just physically, but in ways that spoke to emotional and intellectual development that Calvin had barely noticed while focusing on business concerns. "Good morning, Dad," Marcus said, his tone carrying the cautious politeness that had characterized their interactions since Calvin's increased involvement in household affairs. "Are you staying home today?" "I am," Calvin replied. "In fact, I was hoping the three of us could have a conversation before you leave for school." "Would that be all right?" Marcus glanced between his father and Marjorie, clearly trying to read a situation that felt charged with unspoken significance. "Is something wrong?" "No," Calvin said, then corrected himself. "Actually, yes, something has been wrong for a long time. But I'm hoping we can make it right." 20 minutes later, they gathered in the library where Calvin had first encountered the chess lessons that had begun his journey toward understanding. Calvin had chosen this room deliberately. It was where he'd first reacted with defensive anger to something he didn't understand, and it seemed appropriate to return here for what he hoped would be a very different kind of conversation. Calvin had brought with him a package that he placed on the table between the chairs where Marcus and Marjorie usually sat for their educational sessions. The rectangular shape was clearly a chess set, but the quality of the wooden box suggested something more significant than a casual gift. "Before I say anything else," Calvin began, looking directly at Marjorie, "I owe you an apology that's 15 years overdue. I've just discovered your professional credentials, your teaching background, and the scope of expertise you've been applying to my son's education without any recognition or acknowledgement from me." Marjorie's expression remained carefully controlled, but Calvin caught a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, or caution about where this conversation might lead. "I found your diploma," Calvin continued. "Your teaching certificate, the documentation of your professional achievements. The evidence of everything you've given up to work for my family." He paused, feeling the weight of his next words. "Marjorie, I've been employing one of Connecticut's most accomplished educators to manage my household, while paying strangers to provide my son with inferior educational services. The scope of my blindness is staggering, and I'm deeply ashamed of how I've failed to see your true value." Marcus looked between his father and Marjorie with growing amazement. Marjorie was a real teacher? Like professionally? "A master teacher," Calvin replied, his voice carrying new respect. "With advanced degrees and recognition for excellence in her field. Someone who sacrificed her calling to help raise you with expertise I never recognized." Calvin opened the chess set, revealing pieces carved from ebony and maple with extraordinary craftsmanship. Each piece was a small work of art, representing not just quality, but reverence for the game's strategic depth. "This is for both of you," Calvin said, "to honor what you've shared and what I was too proud to value. But more than that, I want to ask if you'd be willing to teach me, not just chess, but how to see Marcus's educational needs, the way a professional educator sees them. How to support his development rather than just manage his schedule." Marjorie's professional composure finally cracked, revealing something Calvin had rarely seen: genuine emotion breaking through years of careful dignity. "Mr. Rhodes," she said softly, "I appreciate your acknowledgement more than you know, but my commitment has always been to Marcus's well-being, regardless of recognition." "That hasn't changed." "I know," Calvin replied, "and that's exactly why I need to learn from you. You've been putting Marcus's needs first, while I've been putting my own priorities first." I want to change that, but I need guidance from someone who understands how. Marcus had been silent during this exchange, but now he moved to the chess set and carefully lifted the ebony king, examining its craftsmanship with the appreciation of someone who understood the game's complexities. "Does this mean we can play together again?" he asked, looking between the two adults. "All three of us?" Calvin felt something release in his chest, a tension he'd carried for months without recognizing it. "That's exactly what it means," he said. "If Marjorie is willing to teach a stubborn businessman how to think like an educator." For the first time in their entire relationship, Marjorie smiled at Calvin without reservation. "I think we can arrange that," she said. The first lesson took place that very afternoon. After Calvin had called Marcus's school to excuse him from classes, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, when Calvin viewed any deviation from academic schedule as educational negligence. Now sitting at the library table with the beautiful new chess set between them, Calvin realized that some lessons were more important than attendance records. "Chess is about relationships," Marjorie began, her voice carrying the patient authority Calvin now recognized as that of a master teacher. "Not just between the pieces, but between the players. Each move is a conversation." Marcus nodded with the familiarity of someone who'd heard this wisdom before, but Calvin found himself listening with the intensity he usually reserved for crucial business presentations. Here was knowledge he'd never encountered in any MBA program, strategy that was simultaneously intellectual and emotional, competitive yet respectful. "Let's start with how the pieces move," Marjorie said, setting up the board. "Calvin, I know you're familiar with the basics, but humor me. Sometimes the most important learning comes from revisiting what we think we already understand." Calvin nodded, though privately he wondered how much strategy a chess game could really contain. He'd always viewed board games as simple diversions, puzzles with clear solutions for those intelligent enough to calculate properly. But as Marjorie began explaining not just how pieces moved, but why they moved that way, Calvin started to understand that his assumptions were as flawed here as they'd been about everything else. "The pawn seems weak," Marjorie said, moving one of the small pieces forward. "It can only move one square at a time, can only capture diagonally. But pawns are the soul of chess. They create structure, define territories, and when they work together, they can control the entire board." Marcus picked up the theme with enthusiasm. "And they can become queens," he added. "If you get a pawn all the way across the board, it can transform into the most powerful piece." Calvin found himself thinking about the metaphor despite himself. How many people had he dismissed as pawns, useful but essentially unimportant, without recognizing their potential for transformation or their role in creating the structures that made everything else possible? "Now," Marjorie said, "let's play a three-way game. Calvin, you'll play white. Marcus has black. I'll coach both of you, but you'll make your own decisions." The game began simply enough. Calvin made moves that seemed logical from a business perspective, seizing central territory, developing pieces toward aggressive positions, looking for tactical advantages that would lead to quick victories. But as the game progressed, he began to realize that his approach was creating problems he hadn't anticipated. "Dad," Marcus said gently after Calvin had made a particularly aggressive move, "you're trying to attack everything at once. But see how that leaves your king exposed?" Calvin looked at the board and realized his son was right. In his eagerness to press advantages, he'd neglected the fundamental responsibility of protecting what mattered most. The parallel to his approach to family life was uncomfortable but undeniable. "What would you suggest?" Calvin asked, genuinely curious about his son's perspective. "Maybe consolidate first," Marcus replied, his tone respectful but confident. "Make sure your foundation is solid before you try to expand," Marjorie smiled approvingly. "That's excellent strategic thinking. In chess, as in life, sustainable success requires balancing ambition with stability. You can't protect everything by controlling everything." Calvin found himself studying the board with new eyes. This wasn't just about moving pieces. It was about understanding consequences, thinking ahead, considering how each decision would affect not just immediate goals, but long-term position. Most importantly, it was about recognizing that other players had their own intelligence, their own strategies, their own valid approaches to the same challenges. "I think I've been playing chess badly my entire life," Calvin admitted. "And I don't mean the board game. That's the beginning of wisdom," Marjorie replied. "Recognizing what you don't know is the first step toward learning what you need to know." As the afternoon progressed, Calvin found himself relaxing into the rhythm of thoughtful play. Marcus proved to be a patient teacher, explaining concepts that Marjorie had taught him and offering gentle corrections when Calvin made moves that reflected more ego than strategy. Watching his son demonstrate not just chess skills, but pedagogical patience, Calvin realized that Marjorie had been teaching Marcus more than games. She'd been modeling how to teach, how to guide others toward understanding without diminishing them. "You're learning," Marcus observed as Calvin made a move that protected his king while still advancing his position. "That was much better." "I have good teachers," Calvin replied, looking at both Marcus and Marjorie with genuine gratitude. The game ended with Marcus achieving a checkmate that was both elegant and instructive. Not a crushing defeat, but a demonstration of principles, correctly applied over time. Calvin found himself applauding his son's victory with pure pride, uncontaminated by the competitive instincts that usually made losing feel like personal failure. "Again?" Marcus asked hopefully. "Absolutely," Calvin replied. "But this time, let me see if I can think more than one move ahead." Marjorie began resetting the pieces with the deliberate care that Calvin was learning to recognize as respect for the game itself, not just its outcomes. "Chess teaches patience," she said as she worked. "Every good move requires considering not just what you want to happen, but what your opponent might do in response, and what you'll do after that." "Like parenting," Calvin said, the insight arriving with sudden clarity. "Exactly like parenting," Marjorie agreed. "The best moves are the ones that serve both immediate needs and long-term development. Force creates resistance, but guidance creates growth." Calvin looked around the library, at his son arranging pieces with careful attention, at Marjorie preparing to share knowledge that came from decades of professional experience, at the afternoon light streaming through windows onto a scene of genuine learning and mutual respect. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what mattered most. The three-way chess lesson had become something larger than a game. It was a model for how they could be together, each person contributing their strengths, each person learning from the others, each person valued for who they were rather than what they could provide. Calvin was finally learning to play the most important game of his life. 6 months later, the morning light streaming through the library windows illuminated a scene that had become as natural as breathing. Calvin sat across the chessboard from Marcus, both of them studying a complex position, while Marjorie prepared tea at the side table. The photograph that would later sit in a place of honor in Calvin's office captured this moment. 3 people of different generations and backgrounds, united not by hierarchy, but by mutual respect and genuine affection. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Real change, Calvin had learned, required the same patience and strategic thinking that Marjorie had been trying to teach through chess all along. But the results were undeniable. Marcus was thriving in ways that no expensive tutor had ever achieved, not just academically, but emotionally and socially. His confidence had blossomed under the combined attention of a father who was finally present and a mentor whose expertise was finally acknowledged. "Check," Marcus announced, moving his bishop with the kind of calculated precision that made Calvin proud. But it was a different kind of pride than he'd felt before. Not the possessive satisfaction of a successful man whose child reflected well on him, but the genuine joy of watching a young person develop his own strengths and character. Calvin studied the board, taking his time as Marjorie had taught him. "You're forcing me to think 5 moves ahead," he observed with admiration. "When did you get so strategic?" He's always been strategic, Marjorie said, bringing the tea. He just needed space to develop that thinking without pressure. Calvin nodded, understanding the gentle correction embedded in her words. Marcus hadn't changed. Calvin's ability to see and nurture his son's natural gifts had changed. The difference was profound. The household itself had been restructured to reflect new realities. Marjorie's official title was now Educational Coordinator and Family Advisor, with compensation that reflected her master's degree and decades of experience. More importantly, her role in family decisions was acknowledged and valued. Calvin had discovered that consulting someone with professional expertise in child development actually improved family outcomes, a concept that seemed obvious now but had been invisible to him for 15 years. Calvin's business practices had evolved as well. The patience and long-term thinking that Marjorie had modeled in her teaching had found their way into his leadership style. He'd started paying attention to the development and well-being of his employees in ways that went beyond traditional corporate metrics. The results were remarkable: lower turnover, higher productivity, and a company culture that people actually wanted to be part of, rather than simply endure. The Singapore expansion is ahead of schedule, Calvin mentioned during a brief pause in their game. The team credits the new collaborative approach to problem-solving. Marjorie smiled. Funny how treating people as whole human beings with valuable perspectives improves performance. Calvin had learned to appreciate these gentle observations that challenged his old assumptions, while affirming better approaches. Marjorie's wisdom had become integral to decisions both personal and professional. Though she delivered it with the same patient dignity she'd always possessed, Marcus moved another piece, setting up a combination that Calvin could see would lead to checkmate in 3 moves. Instead of feeling frustrated by the impending loss, Calvin felt something he was still getting used to: pride in being outplayed by someone he'd helped develop. "Well done," Calvin said, tipping his king in surrender. "That was beautifully executed." "Marjorie taught me that combination," Marcus replied. "She said it's called quiet strength. Moves that don't look dramatic but create unstoppable pressure." Calvin looked at Marjorie, understanding that they were talking about more than chess. Her entire approach to life exemplified quiet strength, the power that came from consistent excellence, patient development, and unwavering dignity regardless of external recognition. "I think," Calvin said slowly, "that I spent most of my life confusing noise with strength, position with value." He paused, then continued with the kind of reflection that had become natural in this house. "The most important lessons I've learned came from someone I initially valued least." "That's a humbling realization." "It's also a hopeful one," Marjorie replied. "It means there are always opportunities to see more clearly, to recognize value we might have missed before." Calvin stood and walked to the window, looking out at grounds that felt different now. Not like a display of wealth, but like a home where people grew and learned together. Marcus was enrolled in advanced programs that built on his natural strengths rather than forcing him into predetermined molds. Dr. Whitman had been replaced by learning experiences that engaged his curiosity rather than simply filling time with credentials. "Dad," Marcus said, beginning to reset the chess pieces for another game, "when I grow up, I want to build companies like you do. But I also want to teach people like Marjorie does." Calvin felt something profound settle in his chest. His son was envisioning a future that combined ambition with service, success with wisdom. Marcus was learning to see potential where others might see only current circumstances, to value character alongside achievement. "That sounds like an excellent plan," Calvin replied, returning to the table. "The world needs leaders who understand both strategy and humanity." As afternoon light filled the library, Calvin realized that the most important business of his life was taking place right here, not building corporate empires, but nurturing the relationships and values that would outlast any quarterly report. True legacy wasn't measured in stock prices or market share, but in the character of the people you influenced and the wisdom you passed along. The chess pieces were arranged for a new game, But Calvin understood now that the most important lessons happened between moves, in conversations that honored each person's dignity, and recognized that wisdom could emerge from the most unexpected places. Every successful man believes he's built his legacy with his own two hands. Calvin had learned that the best legacies are built by many hands, working together with mutual respect and genuine care. Some discoveries, he reflected, are worth waiting 57 years to make.